Hi everyone. So today I'll be showing you how to make a whole podcast using the Notebook LM from Google. Now I know that Notebook LM has existed for some time now, and it is mainly for like chatting with PDFs or your notes and stuff like that. But there is a feature where you can actually create a whole conversation out of any link, any document that you upload. And I'll come to that. Before, I'll show you what Notebook LM is, and also I'll be testing it with one of the articles which can be slightly controversial, because previously you would have seen that the Google Gemini tends to be too much politically correct, that it tries. This was also the case with the image generation, that it was trying to be like what people call as ultra woke, like that thing. So it was trying to be that. And again, like, I try to take something controversial just to test it out. That is not exactly like my own thought process or my views. I have generated a full article using Perplexity. I have Perplexity, and I'll try to see how the podcast is generated on Notebook LM, and whether the AI tries to manipulate us or like deviate from the actual article or not. So let's start with it. Firstly, we'll see that we have this page. So here are your like example notebooks, and if you have created any kind of notebooks before, so you can also see that. So this is here. Now we'll create a new notebook. The first thing you will see here is that we can upload sources like PDF, text, markdown. We can upload anything. We can select from Google Drive. It also allows us to choose Google Docs and slides. And we can put a link. So we'll be using this one. So any random link, or we can directly paste some text. We can choose up to 50 of these sources. And here you can see, basically you can add different sources. You can also add a note here if you want. So I can write anything and this becomes a note. So now it is one of the sources, and with this you can you can add some kind of note with the sources that you are uploading. I'll remove this one from here, delete notes, and here is the place where you can start chatting. Now what I'll do is that this is the place. You go here, you click on website URL, and this is actually a topic like misuse of radical feminism. And again, I have created it. You can see I have created it 7 minutes before, and I have created it 15 minutes ago, and this is generated. I'll also put the link of this particular article in the description so that you can see how much it deviates from the actual article or not. That is the whole reason, to see whether it tries to make some kind of changes in such a controversial topic, or it does not. Again, not entirely my views, although I agree with some points, but not entirely my views. This is AI generated. So I'll copy the link from here. I'll post it here. It has been inserted. And you can see this pops up. So this is the summary. Argues while radical feminism aims to dismantle patriarchal structures and everything. You can see this gives an overall summary of what the article is about. Now here you can create an FAQ, study guide, table of contents, timeline, briefing of the document. And here you can chat with it, right? Now this is actually the most interesting part, and what I was talking as like the podcast deep dive conversation of two hosts. So I'll click on generate, and this will take some time, but what it is doing is that it is recreating a conversation between two people discussing the document, and it is actually pretty amazing. So here are the suggested questions. So if I type here, like, let's say, what is You can see it will give the answer. And what I can do is that I can save it to a note, so it becomes the note here. And this is the notebook guide. From the guide, you can also create like FAQs and anything. And you are creating all these notes here. So you can add one of your own notes. You can ask something and pin it as a note. You can do anything with that. And the conversation is still generating. So as we can see that the podcast is generated, right? What I'll do is that I'll go here, I'll download this audio right now, and I'll put this whole podcast now in the video. So you can concentrate on the podcast, and what I suggest is that click on the link of the article I'll be providing in the description box. So click on the link, let the podcast play, and try to compare what they are discussing, whether they are adding or subtracting something from the article, or whether they are trying to change the narrative, or what is the overall discussion moving towards, or it is just like a normal representation. I do not want to insinuate anything. That is why I am leaving it up to you, and I would love if you can comment out what you felt, how accurate is it, or like whether they are trying to manipulate the documents, they are trying to like play safe in this generation of audio. Comment out in the description, in the comment box, sorry. So now what you will hear is the podcast that is generated. It will be around 10 minutes 22 seconds long. So yeah, just open the article and listen to it.
Hey there. So you've given us quite the collection of articles and discussions on a topic that always seems to get people talking.
Yeah, radical feminism, huh? Seems that there's always a lot of debate around it.
Definitely. And you want to look specifically at how it might be misused, or maybe even go too far sometimes.
Right, because like we always say, even with the best of intentions sometimes.
Totally. Even with the best intentions, things can have unexpected downsides, right? It's not always sunshine and roses.
Good point. That's what makes this such a fascinating deep dive, though, right?
For sure. So to be sure we're all on the same page, before we really start digging into the downsides, let's clarify something. What do we even mean when we say radical feminism?
Right, gotta start with the basics.
Exactly. And luckily, you've sent over this misuse of radical feminism article that gives a really solid definition. You know, the whole thing about how it's different from liberal feminism.
Yeah, definitely. They're not the same thing, are they?
Not at all. And that's important for people to realize. See, this article points out how radical feminism isn't really about just legal rights or individual freedoms. Like, it wants to go way deeper, dismantle the whole system it sees as the root cause of gender inequality. Patriarchy.
Basically, completely tear it down and start fresh.
Exactly. It questions the very foundation, not just trying to make small changes within the existing structure.
That's a good distinction to make, for sure.
Right. So you sent over this other article, and it brings up the issue of overgeneralization, which seems to be a big one, you know?
Ah, yeah, like painting with too broad a brush.
Exactly. Because does radical feminism sometimes simplify things too much? Like assuming all men are these oppressors and all women are victims.
Yeah, I see where you're going with that.
And it's not just a general feeling, right? You've even highlighted specific examples from your research, like how some arguments from radical feminists kind of miss how patriarchal systems can actually harm men, too.
Oh, for sure. It's not as simple as men versus women, is it?
Exactly. Think about men of color, working class men. They often have these unique struggles, and just focusing on gender can overlook all that.
That's why the whole idea of intersectionality is so important. You've got to look at the whole picture, right? You can't just focus on one thread, in this case gender, and ignore all the other threads like race and class and how they all weave together.
It's like you're missing the whole tapestry if you only focus on one color.
Exactly. And you know, all this brings up a really important question. Can you really truly fight for equality between genders if you're using generalizations that might push away people who could be on your side?
It's like you might be shutting out potential allies, right?
It's a tough one for sure.
It really is. And that leads us to another point your research brings up. How some of the rhetoric we hear from radical feminists, you know, the things they say, might actually be impacting men's mental health.
Yeah, That's some serious stuff, not something to take lightly.
Absolutely not. One of the studies you flagged really stood out. It talked about how men constantly bombarded with these negative messages, that all men are bad kind of stuff. They actually reported being more depressed, more anxious, all those mental health struggles.
It makes you wonder if there's a connection there.
Right. And while it's true that correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation, it's definitely something to think about, especially when we factor in this whole concept of male disposability that comes up in your sources.
Oh, yeah. It's like society telling men, suck it up, be tough, don't complain.
Right. And because of those expectations, they might not seek help when they need it. They bottle it all up inside.
Which we all know is not healthy.
Not at all. And what's interesting is that this male disposability thing, it's not just some random idea, right? It's everywhere. It's like we reinforce it constantly from the moment they're born through all these messages boys receive as they grow up.
Like even the way we raise them, right? Encouraging them to be stoic and independent and all that.
Exactly. We tell boys to be tough, not to cry, to deal with it themselves. It's almost like we're training them to think needing help is weak. And honestly, that can have awful consequences for their mental health.
No doubt about it. It's a recipe for disaster.
And that's where things get even trickier, because now we're talking about the law. And you've brought up some really important legal questions in your research, like how this whole radical feminist way of thinking, when it gets applied to actual laws, might have some unintended consequences.
Yeah, for sure. Because on the one hand, you absolutely want to address things like, domestic violence, making sure victims are safe,
Right.
and obviously sexual assault, that needs to be taken seriously. But at the same time...
But you can't just forget about fairness for everyone.
Right. Exactly. That's the key thing. Just because we're trying to create a more just world doesn't mean we throw due process out the window.
Right. It's not about punishing one group to lift up another. We've got to find that balance.
Totally. And one area where you highlighted that tension was with domestic violence laws. Specifically, that legal and policy concerns section you mentioned, the whole debate around mandatory arrest policies.
Right, like those must-arrest laws and how some radical feminist activists were really pushing for them.
Which, on the surface, makes sense, right? You want to hold abusers accountable, protect victims, but then you have cases where the guy who gets arrested might actually be the victim himself.
Or even situations where both partners get arrested, even if it was just one person being aggressive. It's like, where do you even draw the line?
And it shows how complicated it all is. Like, just because someone agrees with some ideas of radical feminism doesn't mean they're on board with every single tactic or law that comes out of it.
It's not black and white. It's about nuance, like you always say.
Exactly. And this whole Title IX debate on college campuses is another great example.
Title IX, yeah. Which was obviously created for a really good reason, right? To protect students from being harassed or assaulted. But your research also brought up concerns about how some universities might be going too far with it.
Like, where are the boundaries?
Exactly. Some of these sources you shared talked about how universities might be lowering the burden of proof, to make it easier to get a conviction. And then the accused, who, let's be honest, it's often a guy, doesn't really get a fair chance to defend himself.
Right. So now you have these accusations that some guys are basically getting kicked out of school without a fair hearing.
It's a mess. And what's fascinating is that this isn't just some argument happening in the media, right? You highlighted how even within feminist legal scholarship itself, there's disagreement.
Yeah, it's not all feminists singing from the same hymn sheet.
Yeah.
A lot of feminist legal scholars are really big on due process, making sure everyone's treated fairly under the law, regardless of gender.
Which makes sense, right?
Yeah.
You don't achieve equality by being unfair to the other side.
Exactly. And that leads us to another big one you wanted to unpack. This believe all women movement. I mean, the sentiment behind it is powerful, right?
Totally. Women have been ignored, disbelieved for so long when they come forward with their stories.
Exactly. So this idea of just believing women, no questions asked, it was a reaction to that,
But you also brought up concerns about what happens when that idea is taken to an extreme.
Because, where do you draw the line? Is it ever okay to question someone's story, even a little bit, even if you're trying to be sensitive?
Right. Some of your sources were saying that blindly believing every single accusation with zero nuance or investigation might actually end up harming the very movement it's trying to support.
It's a tough one. Because you want to support survivors, but you also don't want to create a system where innocent people are getting punished.
It's that balance again. How do we support survivors while still making sure that the accused have rights too? It's like walking a tightrope.
You said it. It's about nuance.
Yeah.
And you've done a really good job of highlighting that with the sources you chose for us to delve into today. Like, it's okay to have these tough conversations, to admit that it's complicated.
It's not about having all the answers, right? It's about asking the right questions.
Right.
And I think you've definitely done that. Because at the end of the day, you don't achieve justice by throwing fairness out the window. And that's something you highlighted really well in the sources you picked for this deep dive.
Well, I appreciate that. I try to look at things from all angles, you know.
And you did. Like, you weren't afraid to ask those tough questions. Like, can you criticize parts of a movement without dismissing the real problems it's trying to solve? Or, like, is it possible to fight for equality without making generalizations that could actually make things worse?
Those are the questions that keep me up at night, but they're important ones to grapple with, you know? Especially with such a complex issue.
Absolutely. And speaking of those tough questions, you brought up this whole idea of selective victimhood. Like how sometimes in radical feminist spaces, there's this tendency to act like women are always, without exception, the victims.
Right. It's like the flip side of the same coin, just as limiting as saying women are weak and helpless.
Exactly. It's like, come on, women are complex. They can be victims, but they can also be strong and powerful.
Yeah.
It's about seeing the full picture.
Totally. Women are just as capable of both good and bad as anyone else. It doesn't mean we ignore the ways women have been oppressed throughout history, but we also don't pretend they're incapable of doing anything wrong.
We have to acknowledge the nuance because, like you said earlier, it's not black and white.
Not at all. These overly simple narratives, this us versus them mentality, that's what really holds us back from having productive conversations about gender and equality.
And that brings us to what I think is the biggest takeaway from all of your research. If we're serious about creating a more just world for everyone, we have to be mindful that the methods we use to get there don't end up creating new problems in the process.
It's like that saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Exactly. We can't just charge ahead blindly. We have to constantly be checking ourselves, being open to changing our minds, and being willing to adjust our approach if we realize we're on the wrong track.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into radical feminism, all its complexities and potential pitfalls, I hope everyone listening takes that to heart. Don't be afraid to ask the tough questions. Challenge your own assumptions. And most importantly, never stop fighting for a world where justice and equality are a reality for everyone, not just an idea.